This is the Bay Area Beekeepers Year by me, Kendall. So I'm going to be telling you a little bit of about what bees do in the Bay Area throughout the year and what beekeepers should be doing throughout the year. The Bay Area is its own special climate. So what we read in a lot of beekeeping books, and they're all talking about, this is what you should do for winter and spring starts in April, is not really applicable to a Bay Area beekeeper. So I'm going to go over what is a little more applicable to us, so you know what you should be doing at certain times of the year. Before I get started, I'll tell you a little bit about myself. So this is little Kendall, and I have always had an affinity for critters. I love critters. I've always been bringing back creepy crawlies into my house, much to the dismay of my mother, who did not like all of the spiders and lizards and things I was always bringing home. But I've always wanted to work with animals. So now I actually run a business where I do reverse field trips for schools, and I bring critters into classrooms. So I bring my honeybees in observation hives, but I also do lessons on chickens, pollinators, veggies, native bees, you name it. If it has to do with farm critters, I'm all about it. So usually I go into schools, but right now I'm doing digital lessons. So if you check out my website, sagerfamilyfarm.com, I actually have a whole bunch of digital lessons right now. They're mostly geared at K through 2, because that is my main age group that I work with. And they're all done through this platform. So I actually do live classes now on Tuesdays and Thursdays in the afternoons at 3:30 p.m. So if you've got any little ones that want to learn about some bees or chickens or see my sheep next week, just pop on my website. So let's go back to the meat of things of the Bay Area Beekeepers Year. So what are we doing? So I'm mostly going to be covering, again, what are the bees doing and what should I be doing? So I'm going to start with where we are in the year right now, which is April, May time zone. So right at the beginning of April, what are the bees doing is there are usually huge nectar flows on. So right now they're starting to get a little warmer. There's a lot of wildflowers blooming. A lot of things are popping into bloom. We're still getting some rain right now. So the weather is sometimes a little bit chillier in some areas of the Bay. But if you're in an area like Mountain View or Los Altos, it's warm enough that those bees are out there pretty much as soon as the sun hits them. So they are going crazy for nectar. They are growing like crazy. So the beehive is growing, 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 and they're swarming. So if they think they don't have enough space, or even if they do have enough space, some bees just have the tendency to want to swarm. So that means what I should be doing is I should be inspecting every 1 to 2 weeks. I'm doing swarm prevention, and I'm constantly checking that my bees have space. So the reason why I am checking every 1 to 2 weeks, especially if you're a beginner, is because of a little bit of bee math. So there's bee development stages. So the typical worker bee takes 21 days to go from an egg to an emerging bee. But the queen bee only takes 16 days, which means if it has been a whole month since I looked at my bees, those bees could have swarmed and been long gone by the time I get back to them. So I try, especially with really strong, wonderful colonies, I am looking at my hives every 2 weeks at the outlier just to make sure that they are not preparing to swarm or in the middle of swarming. And actually, I wanted to ask you guys a question just to see how many people in this room already have bees, because if you don't have bees, you're like, what are we doing? But over here in the bottom corner, you can answer me with, yes, I have bees, I have active hives right now, in which case this is exactly what you should be doing right now. If you're in the nope, but I'm getting bees this year category, then this is something to store away for next spring probably, because your bees will be growing quickly, but swarming is probably not going to be an issue for them. It looks like nobody is really in the like, no, but one day I'll get bees. So it looks like Most of us already have active hives, but a good number of us, about 30%, are saying, no, but I'm getting them soon. So this is definitely stuff to keep in mind for next spring for swarm prevention. And those of us with hives, we should be checking out and making sure our hives don't swarm. So next stage, so the stages of swarm prevention, as I've found it to be, are 1, preventative measures. This is nice, calm, like, oh, let's just prevent this swarm. The second stage is I show up and I'm like, oh my God, fix it right now. And then the third stage, which sometimes you happen upon, is, oh, I am far too late. They gone. So I'm going to show you what each of these stages looks like so you at least know what to be looking for inside of your hives. So in the preventative stage, you're going to see a nice healthy beehive. What we're looking at right now is there's honey on the edges of the frame and some of it's open nectar. The middle is capped brood. So as the bees are preparing to swarm, you will actually notice a slight difference in the breakdown of the hive. So the baby bees are eggs for 3 days, they're open larvae for 6 days, and then they're capped brood for about 12 days. So usually you do see more capped brood because they are capped longer than they are in the other stages of like eggs and larvae. But you should see in general kind of like that good breakdown of there's a bunch of eggs, there's a good amount of larvae, so probably double the amount of larvae than you see eggs, and then there's probably double the amount of capped brood than you see uncapped brood. But as they prepare to swarm, so the queen bee, she is not good at flying. So the worker bees are preparing her to swarm. So they start nipping at her and feeding her a little less. So she's basically doing some cardio and going on a diet so that she can fly. And even then, when she's swarming, she still needs to take those rests, which is why we're able to go and catch them on tree branches and all these other things. But she stops laying eggs quite as frequently because during this, as they're nipping her around, she's really not getting this nice peaceful time to go lay eggs, and she's being fed less. So she kind of stops laying quite as many eggs. So you're going to see a subtle shift to more capped brood and less eggs and larvae. So you'll definitely see like, ooh, it's looking like I'm mostly seeing capped brood and I'm not seeing very much in the other stages. And this can be a little tip off. It is hard to notice. Sometimes you'll see some queen cups, which unfortunately I don't have a picture of, but it looks like a little downward facing like top of an acorn. Those are usually no big deal as long as nothing is in them. So bees will just start making those. But now we go to the, oh my God, fix it right now stage. So the stage that sometimes I happen upon my bees is I see queen cells. So these are queen cups that are elongated. So they typically are formed towards the bottom of the frames. So you usually see them down at the bottom. If they're scattered all over the frame, this could sometimes mean that they're trying to supersede their queen. So they want to replace her rather than swarming. But right now we are right in the middle of swarm season. So I'd say go ahead and just assume that if you see a bunch of these in your hives, they're about to swarm, very much about to swarm, especially if you see capped queen cells. So the one in, let's see, I can actually even draw over top of this. So right, whoop, that was a terrible circle. Let me try again. Right here, that one is capped, which means that queen is going to hatch or emerge from her cocoon very shortly. So you are within days, if not hours, because I'm not sure when that got capped, of a swarm occurring. So hopefully you've got some extra equipment sitting around. If not, I would not leave this hive for more than a day. So you better be emailing the guild and asking people for equipment if you don't already have equipment. So in this stage, I usually root through my entire hive and find my queen. So it's really important in this stage to find your queen take her and move her to the new equipment. What you do not want to do is be like, oh, they're going to swarm and go smash all of these, because then what might occur is your queen bee and the older bees are going to leave, and now there's not a good viable replacement. Or maybe your hive has already swarmed and then now you have just squished the replacement queens. So it's the queen bee that you want to move. So you want to move her, and then in her hive, you want to make sure there are no queen cells. So you'd smash the queen cells in her hive. I usually look for a few queen cells. So I usually leave like 3 queen cells that are very close together in the replacement hive. If I have a bunch of frames with queen cells, I'll make nukes. So you can put those into as many boxes as you have bees. I will usually take frames with brood on them. And if they have queen cells, these are usually not going to be the viable ones, because I will shake them into the box with a queen like they're swarming. So I shake them in with her. I usually try to remove about half of the bees at least, so to make sure the bees are leaving, and only leave 3 queen cells in the original hive to reduce the chance that it's going to send out multiple swarms. Because if I have 2 queen cells far away from each other, then 2 queens might emerge, and their first instinct is just like, oh, no problem, I'll just go. And so if they have enough resources, they will still put out a swarm. So for this mode, you have to remove a lot of bees, and you have to make sure you move to the queen. So next stage is, you are too late. Oops, and let me remove my drawings. So these are opened queen cells. And actually, this one over here, this one is opened properly by a queen. It looks like it's kind of this little can opener sawed edge right at the top. So that is the queen emerging from the queen cell on her own accord. So she came out of there. These other ones over here, it looks like the caps are still on the bottom and they've been opened on the side. So this jealous queen, what she did, the first one that emerged out of her queen cell, went and chewed a hole in those queen cells and stung her baby sisters, because she's like, nope, I'm not going to have a fair fight. I'm going to get rid of these other queens. So what we're looking at here is my hive has already swarmed. There's at least one replacement queen that made it out, and then she murdered her nearby baby sisters. So there should just be 1 queen around. Since there were probably a lot of queen cells in this hive, there could have been secondary swarms. And the reason why we don't want to like put swarms out into the neighborhood is because, sure, if another beekeeper catches it, great, whatever. Or as a homeowner, if I see one on a bush, like, no problem, that'll move on. If those bees move on into someone's attic, into a shed, this can turn into a really expensive removal. And that leaves a really bad taste in our community's mouth. So it's definitely one of those things that we want to avoid swarms, so that we avoid very strict beekeeping laws, because this is how laws can get made against beekeepers. It's how we get complaints against us, and why bees might not be welcome in our communities. Additionally, like, it's just better to keep tabs on your bees. So I like to know what my bees are up to, and I'd rather requeen them than let them randomly swarm into the neighborhood, especially if that's not one of my best colonies. I could actually be spreading disease into the neighborhood. So if that was a sick hive, now I've got an unmanaged, maybe beehive in an oak tree that is being unchecked with disease that I could be spreading to other beekeepers in my area. So we do want to avoid swarms. So this too late stage, if you are checking every 2 weeks, you should be able to avoid this. So that would be great for all beekeepers involved. So I'm going to move on to, actually, let me do one more thing before I move on to June and July, is because I did mention that the hives are growing like crazy. So if you're new to supering your colony or expanding your brood chamber, so adding more boxes, is when do I add more boxes? So I usually work with 10 frame equipment. So there's 10 frames in each of my boxes. And when my bees in the springtime are occupying about 70%, I will usually add another box because I know that's where they're going. Especially if I know I'm not going to check them for another 2 weeks. I know probably within 1 week, those bees are going to be full. So if they are only occupying half of the box, then so like about 5 of 10 frames. So that means when you're looking from the top, you should see bees clustering around 5 frames. So if you only see them clustering around 5 frames, give them another week or 2. That's totally fine. And then add your box. If you add boxes too early, it's not really going to hurt the bees, but usually what I see is a chimney effect of the bees tend to go up through the middle and not necessarily expand to occupy the entire box, especially if you're working with foundation only, which I think I actually have some props here because I'm in my beekeeping office. So I have tons of beekeeping equipment just laying around. So here's my teaching box. So over here, this one is foundation. So this is actually plastic foundation. So the bees actually have to draw this out. So they need to make honeycomb on this before it's useful. So especially if I'm adding blank foundation frames, I'm going to wait until they're occupying at least 70%. And even then, the odds of them drawing out the outermost frames are a little slim to none. If you've been beekeeping for a little while, you probably have some leftover drawn combs. This has some child fingerprints in it because it's been to school. But this comb, it's hard to see, but it actually has the comb drawn out. So the bees actually built foundation on this. I harvested honey out of this, and then I gave it back to the bees. So if I'm adding a box with drawn comb, then the bees are more likely to just move on up. If I'm adding a box with just foundation on it, then, and actually since I'm just picture in picture over here, let me go full screen. So if I'm adding a box with just foundation on it, then what I usually do is I take frames out of the middle of the bottom box, so the one that's filled with bees. I will take 2 frames with brood on it and move them upstairs. So that means I will have 2 frames in the middle and 4 blank frames on either side, totaling up to 10 frames in my box. Then what do I do with these 2 blank frames that I opened up? So I will usually then kind of reorganize my bottom box filled with bees. I will put 2 frames of bees in the center, so with brood in them. I always try to keep the brood in pairs, so it's a little easier for the worker bees to feed them. So you put the 2 frames in the middle with brood, then put your 2 blank foundation frames on either side of that, and then the rest of the frames that were in your bottom box. So spacing them out a little bit, and especially having them closer to the center, makes the bees more likely to draw these out. And then moving stuff upstairs, man, I forget which beekeeper in the guild said this, but I have stolen it from them and I use it now since, is if I just took a blank second story and plopped it on top of your house, you would probably never go up there. But if I take your fridge and your TV and I move them upstairs, you're going to go up there. So same thing for the bees. If we take babies, move them upstairs, they're going to go up there. They're not going to leave their babies alone. So that's why it can help them move up. So as you're growing, that is a great strategy to have them grow, especially if you're using foundation only. So let's see, let's go back to our slide deck and take a look at what we're going to be doing in June. So in June, usually they're still swarming, they're still collecting nectar, and growth is kind of reaching their peak. So I usually find that my strong colonies and even some of my weaker colonies that were not looking so hot in February started picking up in March. They're usually reaching their maximum size at June. Especially here in the Bay Area where we deal with drought a lot of the times. June, we usually still have some moisture. So they're going to peak off here, and then as it gets hotter, it's going to taper down. So, or they're going to plateau at least. So they're reaching this growth plateau. What I am usually doing in June is inspecting every 2 weeks. Usually for me, if I've done swarm prevention methods by either dividing my hives on my own, like I described in the, oh my God, fix it now section. You can also do that in the preventative stage. So before you see queen cells, you can divide your hives. I usually do that every single one of my hives at some point in the season. If I didn't like that genetic line, I will replace the queen bee. If I did like that genetic line, then I'll keep those bees and raise a new queen as is. So I'm usually doing my swarm prevention in February, March, April. So by June, I usually don't have to worry about it quite as much, especially as I'm monitoring their space. The big difference for June is I'm starting to monitor for varroa mites. And I will go through that a little bit more. Oh, actually, we're also getting honey. So this is lovely me with a frame of honey. So usually by June, even with packages, I've found that the packages we get through the guild are really rigorous and make a lot of honey. So depending on what area you're in, you might already be getting honey even from a package in June. It's also not uncommon not to get honey from a package in your first year. So don't feel like a complete and utter failure if you didn't get honey, especially if we missed a lot of the nectar flow. So in hotter, drier years, it's a little harder. Hopefully we're in a wetter year, but you never know. So this is what honey looks like when we're harvesting it. So we're looking for completely capped frames, not open cells with the shiny nectar in them. You're waiting for them to be capped. So if you're getting eager and you're like, yes, it's June, I need honey, make sure it's capped. So here is an example of what it looks like when it's getting there, but it's not quite there. So the bees are still drying out the nectar. Nectar can be up to 80% water, and honey is closer to 18%. So we don't want to harvest it too early. There are some layman's ways of checking where you can take the frame and fling it towards the ground and see if you get this spray of water. That usually means it's way too watery. Don't even bother. If you don't, you can still get honey that's closer to 22%, which is still way too high. So you're going to have honey that ferments and not in a good way. So be patient and wait for the bees to cap it, especially in the early season. They will get to capping it if it's made in June. So the next thing I wanted to talk about is mite checking. So I wish I had a good video of this. So I'm going to have to make one when I start doing some mite checks in a little bit. But this is Bernardo Nino doing a mite check, so a sugar roll on one of my hives. And I'm going to pop out of picture in picture so I can show you some of my stuff for that. So the tools you need to be checking for mites are kind of an old peanut butter container with the screw-on lid. You can cut out the middle and put some screening in there. So it's kind of like a sugar shaker in there. You'll also need, I usually carry around a jar of powdered sugar. So not granulated sugar, but powdered sugar. You'll need a half-cup measurer, and you will need a bucket, preferably cleaner than mine. So I would wash this out before I would use it because this is going to be hard to use as is. But this has been in my garage since last season, so it's dirty. So these are the tools that you'll need for mite checking. And the reason why you want to start monitoring for mites in June is because this is when, especially if you haven't split your hives before, the mite load can start taking off, and you want to catch it before it gets to be a really severe infestation. There are a lot of different camps out here on whether to treat, how to be all natural, what kind of treatment to use if you want to go organic methods or something else. And so I'm not going to cover that entirely. What I'm advocating for is know how many mites are in your hive so that if they pass away in the fall, you kind of have a better idea. That is usually, especially, I'm with the UC Master Beekeepers program that's up at Davis. That's usually the first thing you ask you if you're like, oh, man, my hive died. I don't know what happened. They're like, well, what were you using to treat for mites? How many mites did you have? What were you doing to monitor your mites? Mites are honestly one of the biggest suspected causes of the decline in bee population. The varroa mites themselves, or varroa destructor, bite the bees. They're usually found on the stomach. So just the fact that you're not seeing mites does not mean that they are not there. If you are a beekeeper, you are also a mite keeper. They are in your hive. And these mites, they're kind of like mosquitoes to bees. They bite the bee and they vector disease. So the mosquitoes feed on blood. These varroa mites feed on fat bodies. So they're sucking out fat bodies, which are also linked to the bee's immune system. So they're eating the immune system and injecting the bee with viruses at the same time. So it's definitely really important to have some method of control of the varroa mites. And the best experts say best practices are use 2 different methods. So the methods that I use are splitting. So I'm using a mechanical method here. So I'm creating a period of broodlessness in my hive, which the varroa mites breed in the cell with the bees. So as the bees are developing, the varroa mite is developing in that cell as well. So by having a period where there are no baby bees, that cuts down the level of mites in your hive. Even though it does cut down the number of bees in your hive, also cuts down the number of mites. And I find that it has a bigger effect on the mites than it does ultimately on the bees. So that's my early season control. And my late season control is formic acid in the form of, I believe it's check mite, or no, it's mite away quick strips, I think is what I use. So, but it's a formic acid method of control. So that is a organic method that can be used while honey is flowing. So those are the 2 I usually like to use, but ultimately I should be rotating through multiple methods. So again, at the very least, just check your hive for mites, and then you are at least armed with information when you want to go make your decision on how you want to keep your mites under control. So over here, I'll go back to my tools. So to check for mites, the first thing you're going to do is look for a frame with brood on it. So you probably want to have either emerging brood or have larvae that are just about to be capped, because we want to find a lot of nurse bees, because the varroa mites, they are kind of hopping onto nurse bees and looking for a larva that's just about to be capped into its cocoon, because that's where the mother mite wants to sneak in, lay her eggs, have her babies, make more mites. So you don't want to be taking your frames from honey supers or with nectar and bee bread on it. You want to find from the center of the brood nest, take your frame and your bucket and shake the bees into the bucket. I usually shake 2 to 3 frames into my bucket. Any of your forager bees that are in there are going to fly back away to the hive, and your nurse bees that are carrying the higher mite load are going to be in the bucket. Then you can usually tap your bucket a little bit. All the bees fall to kind of one corner. Take a half cup of bees, scoop it up. I usually aim for a level-ish cup. This is about 300 bees in your half cup. So then you'll open your sugar shaker, put your bees into the cup, and pop the lid on straight away. So you don't want all these bees flying away. You want approximately 300 bees. So the quicker you do this, the better. Then you take about 1 tablespoon, or I use a hive tool and just heaping hive tool amount, which is about a tablespoon of powdered sugar, again, powdered, not granulated, and put that through the screen mesh. This feels like the worst recipe ever of like half cup bees, 1 tablespoon powdered sugar. But put this in here And the standard way to do a sugar roll is to shake it around, kind of shake vigorously, and shake the same way each time you do this for about 30 seconds. After that, you'll take your bucket, which by now you should have, usually before I start shaking, I dump the bees back into the hive. So I have a nice empty, clean bucket. Then I'm going to take this and shake vigorously until usually mites will come out. So give it a good shake for, I usually give it 10 seconds of a shake, and that's usually plenty good enough. Put your very angry jar of bees to the side. And then the one thing I don't have with me is a spray bottle. I carry a spray bottle filled with just plain water and then spritz into your bucket. So that will start dissolving the sugar, and then will expose your mites. So let me go back to my slide so I can show you what one of these mites looks like. So over here, after you have sprayed it down, you will see these little red mites. And I usually like to count all the mites in my bucket. I usually do it twice, especially if it is a higher number. So check for however many mites you have. Usually I use the threshold of treatment of a 3% infestation rate. So there's some math involved with all this, if you have 300 bees and what's the size of your hive and all this. But 300 bees, if you count 9 mites in that, it is time for you to intervene in some way. The mite population grows exponentially. So if you already have a 3% infestation rate in June, by October, you are going to have a dead hive if you do nothing. So usually when I hit a 3% infestation rate, I will intervene in some way. And my later season control is usually doing formic acid. But if it's early enough in the season, I can divide my hive as well. And this is something I put in my notes later for breeding of how many mites were in my hive, and was this hive doing well, or did they keep their mite levels low naturally? So a lot of beekeepers keep notes on what they're having to do to manage their colonies in terms of mite treatment. It also lets you know, so I actually have one apiary that I was doing monthly checks, and I got like 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, and then the next month I got 20. Which is an unreasonable level for the mites to naturally grow. Of where did all these mites come from? So I was probably nearby to somebody else's apiary that had a lot of mites, and my hive started robbing their hive and bringing mites back, because there's no way my mite load could have naturally procreated to that level. So I usually see like 1 to 2, and then the next month I might see 6 to 8. And that's usually, I'll start treating at that level. So if you see a big spike within a month, and if you're going from 0 to large numbers above the 3% threshold, that's usually a sign that your hive has robbed out somebody who has a lot of mites in their beehive and their hive was collapsing. So that's, and then at the very end, take your little ghostly bees and you can dump them back in your hive. You have shaken them up a lot. They're usually not dead. I don't know if anyone has looked at how these concussed bees work later on in the hive, but it's a small sacrifice in the grand scheme of, if you have a really big, strong hive with 60,000 bees in it, 300 bees is not a huge sacrifice. Do make sure you don't shake your queen in there, since you're working in the brood nest. So check your frames really carefully. That's the one bee you don't want to roll in this sugar roll. So you will likely end up damaging her, and the bees do not like a damaged queen. So do make sure your queen is not in there. So moving on to July and August, what the bees are doing versus what I'm doing. The bees are collecting nectar and water by this point. Usually by July and August, it is getting very hot and dry, which means a lot of nectar sources are going to start drying up. So they're kind of hitting a growth plateau, either because they're so big that they've kind of reached max capacity for the queen bee in terms of laying. But additionally, maybe they're slowing down a little bit just because there's not as much food out there, so they might not need as many foragers. Mites are also continuing to reproduce. So you want to be doing some checks regularly to monitor your mite levels. So I usually try to do them every month. And I especially try to make sure I'm doing August and September. So those are the most important months. If you missed it in the spring, I like to monitor starting in the spring, but do not miss August or September. Those are usually the highest months for mites. So do some checks in those months, no matter what. What I am usually doing is I'm slowing down my inspections because the bees are not bringing in quite as much nectar, especially for my South Bay hives. It's usually getting so dry and crispy out there that things are slowing down a bit. So I usually slow down my inspections. I provide water year round just to make sure that I don't get caught in the lurch not having water. But provide water for your bees during the hottest months, because if they are not going to your water, they're maybe going to your neighbor's pool or your neighbor's fountain, and your neighbor might not be very happy with that. You should also be continuing to monitor your mites and treat if needed, and you're still harvesting honey. So over here is one of the methods for providing water for bees. So you can do it through pet waterers. We usually like to put rocks in them so the bees don't drown. You can also use corks. Bees' favorite thing is water on like wet rocks. So they love to drink off of wet rocks. So if you have a running fountain that kind of trickles down rocks, the bees would absolutely love that. This is also why they like the sides of pools. So with water splashes up and now they're around the pool right when everybody wants to be in their pool. So providing some water is pretty important. If you have freestanding water that is not in motion, vector control actually gives you these mosquito fish that you can dump in there, and they will eat mosquito larvae and not harm the bees. So you can do that if you have a bigger vessel of water, but usually I have smaller ones and I kind of tend to dump them every time I'm out there and refill. So going into September and October, what the bees start doing is, now that it's been hot and dry for a while, usually, is the bees really start seeking food. So they get a little excited over food and they start robbing each other. So strong colonies are going to try and steal food from weaker colonies. The colony is usually shrinking by this point. So if you take honey away, maybe they're not producing more. So if you put your honey super back on, maybe they're not filling it back up. This is also around the time of year where the mite population peaks. So that's why you should be monitoring leading up to this stage, just because by the time you get to October, you might be looking at a dead colony. I remember years and years ago, I didn't monitor quite as frequently. And when I went and checked in September, I was getting such high mite levels from my colonies, which looked fabulous from the outside. So these colonies just looked so strong, but I shook out mites and I was getting numbers of 30 to 60 mites in my rolls. And I was like, I am looking at a dead colony right now. These bees are not going to make it through this winter because their infestation level is so high, which means their viral load is going to get high. So those bees, even though it's a huge colony, looks great in September, October, their viral load, which I can't see viruses, as illustrated by our current pandemic, that is going to take this colony down. So definitely be monitoring up to this point and through this point so you can treat. So usually by October, I am doing my last harvests of the year so that I'm not bothering the bees too much in the winter period. So looking at some of these things in action is the bees are getting more desperate for food. So this picture is actually of a bee robbing a hot lips sage blossom. So the reason why she's robbing this blossom is because you can see she's not going into the front of the flower. She's kind of going in right at the bottom of it. And that's because this little honeybee is too fat to get in this flower. So a hummingbird usually likes to come to this flower and they'll stick their long beak in there and lick up the nectar. This bee, too fat to get in there, so she bites a hole in the bottom and then sticks her tongue in and she steals the nectar without actually pollinating this plant. So that's why I usually call it robbing the flower. So other bees, I usually notice other bees on this throughout the year. So I will see carpenter bees and bumblebees on sage plants throughout the year, but I will not see honeybees on this until it gets really hot and dry. So in the fall, I start seeing honeybees on the sage as well. So this is kind of an indication that they are getting a little more desperate for food when they go for harder to reach food, where they have to do 2 steps to get into that flower. What robbing looks like at the colony level is usually bees at every little crevice of your hive. That's because the bees who live in there, they know how to come in and out. The bees that do not live in there smell honey inside and are going at every little crack and crevice trying to get it out. This is also a period of time, if you have a screened bottom board that has a single screen, so just one screen, you can actually get bees begging for food and your colony will give away honey. So nurse bees are trained that if there is something hungry, they will feed it. And so sometimes hungry robbing bees will come up to the bottom screen and say, I'm hungry. And the nurse bee's like, oh, all right. And we'll give away your honey. So I usually try to have a double screen so there can be no outside bee contact. This colony has an entrance reducer on it. So it has a little stick in the front, reducing the entrance very small. So usually in the fall, I have my entrance reducers on to reduce the risk of robbing. So especially if you're unfamiliar with all of the mite monitoring stuff, then if you have a weaker colony, you are less likely to get robbed out and spread disease to stronger colonies in your neighborhood. So for the overall health of bees in our community. In November and December, usually the bees, like it's starting to kind of be winter time, but the bees are seeking food on sunny days. The colony is probably going to start dwindling if it's sick. So if it has a higher viral load, a colony that looks strong in August might start to look a little shabby by November, December. The bees are also usually moving up in the hive just a little bit to where there is excess honey. So they're moving out of the bottom brood chambers and moving up in the hive. Usually in November, December, if it's starting to rain or be colder, I only do external inspections. So I'm looking at the outside of my hives and I'm storing unused equipment. So all that honey harvesting stuff, if I've got extra supers, I will run all of my frames through a freezer for 48 hours to kill any little bugs that are in there, and then usually bag my boxes to store them for the winter so that nothing else gets into them. So I'm trying to keep them free from wax moths, hive beetles, mice, all these things. So hopefully I have a good storage area to keep that in. So, and this is also the point where our beekeeping books start to get pretty scary of winter is coming. Oh, this is terrible. And you might be thinking like, so this is what the beekeeping book is thinking, is there's snow everywhere. You got to be clearing snow away from your entrance. Meanwhile, in California, in the San Francisco Bay Area, January looks like this. So there's things blooming, the bees are out on a sunny day. So don't really listen to, if you're looking from a bee book where someone's living in Montana or Minnesota, somewhere where there is a lot of snow, there's a lot of cold weather, you're getting freezing temperatures. That is not for us. So don't pay attention to that winter sort of thing, because it's like, what do I do? Do I have to wrap my hives? Do I have to, do I have to have a heat lamp for my bees? No, just monitor your entrances at the very least. On a sunny day, you should see bees coming in and out. In this picture, there's even one bee, which I will try to circle over here. So this bee here is actually bringing in pollen. So that is a really good sign that resources are coming into this hive. So that's something I really like to see, because if there is low activity, sometimes it could be robbing bees, taking things away. So I like to see things going in as a good clarification. If the weather is windless, sunny, above 60 degrees, you can open your hive in the middle of January, in December. Just give a quick peek. Don't muck around in there for a really long time. The bees aren't going to like their babies being chilled. But in general, you can open the hives year round. So if it's a little on the cooler side, I usually just do the external inspections. On a sunny day, if you do not see bees coming and going, give it a quick lift of the lid and see if your bees are still in there. If your bees are dead and gone, clear up your hive. So don't leave equipment sitting out there to be robbed out, to potentially spread disease to other apiaries and other beekeepers nearby. So do store your equipment as best you can, and that's going to keep it in the best condition for when you restart a hive later in the spring. So the other thing that the bees are doing is usually if the brood chambers are down, like so this yellow mass in the bottom, the bees start moving up in the hive. So the bees are kind of moving upstairs. So oftentimes I'll find some bottom layers that are maybe not being used. So when I open my hives back up in the spring, I'm usually doing some reorganization. So I'm taking away those bottom boxes and adding space on top. But this is usually what the bees are doing in the winter, the Bay Area winter time, is they'll still move up a tiny bit. So they might abandon those bottom boxes. So in January, I actually usually do see quite a bit of pollen. We have a lot of stuff that blooms in January. They're already ramping up for spring in January. So January is really our early springtime. So these books that say, oh, springtime, like through March, you should be painting equipment and getting ready for your bees. Like our season is starting in January. So I'm usually in January, towards the end of January, I'm usually doing my first inspections. I'm reversing those brood chambers, and I'm checking that the bees have enough space. So I'm already doing some prep. So over here are a few examples of things that I walked around last January and just snapped some pictures of things that were blooming. So I've got some rosemary blooming there, and the bee has some pollen on her back. So she's probably collecting nectar and getting that pollen spread on her back. So if you see those little ghost bees with the greenish pollen on their back, they've been in a rosemary bush. There is a bee in this yellow flower up here, and that is actually a broccoli flower. And then my borage was already blooming in January. So we actually have a lot of January blooms. So the bees on a nice warm day are probably out collecting stuff. Additionally, so this is a January hive right here. So it looks like they are clustering on 1, 2, 3, 4. If I was being generous, I'd give them 5 frames. So this colony still has space to grow, especially if those are drawn frames on the outside. So if we were having warm weather over 2 weeks, and this is what I saw in January, I would definitely check them within 2 weeks to make sure they've got space. If it was colder, you might give them a little more time to grow. But definitely, if we're seeing 70-degree days in January, I'm going to be treating it like it's spring already and doing inspections no more than 2 weeks apart on a colony like this. This is a colony where I may have waited too long. So they were taking up 10 frames, and they're starting to build burr comb all on top. It can get a lot worse than this. So usually if I have not given them enough space early on, there's tons of burr comb everywhere. So I want to be adding a super on top before it gets too bad. Additionally, so this is usually what I like to see in the January time frame. So these guys, they have a little bit of a spotty pattern, which means like there's some empty holes here. Maybe there's some larvae in there, so it would depend on what you're seeing in there. It's not uncommon to have some nectar stored throughout. So if you have some sporadic patterns, so this pattern is not 100% textbook, but it's also not bad. So it's showing that I have some cocoons in there. I'm also seeing this nice ring of pollen here. So I've got some bee bread off on the sides, and then I've got honey in the corners. So this is something that I do like to see in January, as I want to make sure they're bringing in food, they're preparing to raise more babies, and hopefully their brood pattern kind of regulars out after this. But it's not the end of the world if they have a little bit of spottiness in the wintertime. And then this is another good one. So this one has larvae in it. So this is a younger capped one in the center. So there's cappings in the center. There's these ring of like whitish looking things. So those are some younger larvae. So I do like to see larvae in all stages. And then looping back around to February and March. So what we were doing for the past few months is the bees are really ramping up. So they're bringing in nectar and pollen, ramping up for spring. They're even starting drone production, and I'm already starting swarm prevention in February and March. So I'm usually, again, starting first thing in February, I am usually inspecting every 1 to 2 weeks because it is already spring in our area. So I'm definitely doing hardcore swarm prevention in February and March, and I'm splitting and breeding my great colonies. So let's take a look at some of our, this is actually a really well-fed colony. So this is something I like to see in colonies where I am going to split them and breed them, is these larvae are sitting in these milky pools of royal jelly. So this colony is feeding their babies really well. So they're probably going to make some really great queens for me because they are just feeding these babies nonstop. So that's really good from a nutrition standpoint. Additionally, you might see the drone production starting in February. So over here, we've got, we've got this guy on my finger that is a drone. So you should start seeing them outside in March, oftentimes. So I do notice that my hives generally stop drone brood production, at least, especially in the South Bay, they actually stop when it gets really hot and dry. So in my Los Altos apiaries, I usually see them ditch the drones in August if it is a very dry, hot year. In wetter years, sometimes they'll keep them around, but the girls don't like to feed these extra mouths when there is not enough food around. So if there's a creek that ran dry, there's a big nectar source that stopped producing, they will boot out the drones. So usually they restart in January, February, as long as it's getting warm. And what that looks like is over here, we have some female worker brood in here, these cocoons, and then these ones that look a little bit puffier, kind of like popcorn, that is drone brood. So this is typically what we want to see, is a big separation between the flat worker brood and then the drone brood on the sides. So usually they're on the edges of the colony or in between our frames. So if you lift off a box and you've opened all of these cocoons, that's where they like to have the drones. If you see this spotty pattern of a mixture of worker brood and drone brood, so it's kind of like intermixed, that is actually usually a symbol of a failing queen. So she's actually running out of sperm and she's not able to fertilize all of her eggs as she wants. Bees are very strategic in where they put the drones because the drones are the lowest of the totem pole. So I've already talked about how they kick out drones if there's not enough food. They will also leave them out in the cold if we get a cold snap. So the past few years, we've had this kind of terrible like spring, winter, where we get like a week of really hot, beautiful weather and the hive expands because they don't need to spend as much energy warming. And then all of a sudden it gets cold again. And so they have to contract. So by laying the boys on the outsides and the girls in the middle, when they contract, the first bees left in the cold are the drones. So the bees are very strategic on where they are putting drone brood because they want to protect their core group of girls. So girls are usually at the core of the nest, drones are usually towards the edges. And then that is the beekeeper's year? So let's see, I'll stop this slideshow and go full screen, and I'm gonna go back to the chat, and it looks like you guys have been chatting back and forth, and some people have been answering before. So if you still have your question, maybe you should be retyping at the top so that it comes to the top and I will see it. And I'm not answering questions that have already been answered. So question that just popped up to the top is, should you remove burr comb? So burr comb is usually, oh, let me get my frame back. So burr comb is comb that's usually built outside of the frame. It's kind of on the edges, all over the place. I used to be a lot more diligent about removing burr comb, but if it's kind of shallow like this, I usually leave it. So my kind of, do I remove it, do I not remove it, is how many bees am I gonna crush? Am I gonna crush a lot of bees with this? Because bees actually do build like these little bridges and networks in between the frames. So if I'm constantly scraping that off, I'm actually creating a little more work for them, because now they have to go steal wax from somewhere else and rebuild those little pathways. So I actually don't clean all of it off, but if it is just a huge mess and it looks like I'm gonna smash bees by putting my next super back on, I will scrape it clean just so that I don't crush a whole bunch of bees, especially if it's drone brood in the middle, because the bees are just gonna go clear that out, because I have now opened all those cocoons and they will clear it away. Let's see. So Alex is reposting a question that didn't get answered. Do koi fish ponds pose a danger for bees seeking water? That's a good question. I don't really know that. I know that the koi like to eat insects that are on top of the water, so perhaps they do, but it's probably not a big enough problem to really worry about. You may want to have a separate source for water. But the one thing, I guess, about this koi pond, this is just me thinking it through, but if the bees are going to collect water from this source and then being eaten by the koi, that bee is not able to go back to the hive and report the location of the water. So it's a problem that may sort itself out, is if bees are reporting other water sources, then that is sending more water foragers that way, as opposed to a source that's dangerous and the bees kept getting eaten. And actually, the bees do this with toxic plants as well. So if a bee goes to, with its California buckeye, it's one of those trees that is a little toxic. Fuchsia is actually also kind of a toxic plant. But if the bees are going to this toxic source and getting just a little tipsy on this stuff when they return home, if they haven't gotten tipsy yet and they start broadcasting the source, when other bees come back and start reporting this same source, the bees that got sick off of it, or no other bees that got sick off of it, will start headbutting the one that is broadcasting that location, saying like, hey, that stuff is bad, stop broadcasting this. So it could be a self-correcting problem. So if a bee is like, oh man, dude, I almost got eaten by a koi fish, they might do some self-correction and stop broadcasting that location. But I doubt it would be enough to eat your entire beehive. So probably poses a risk, but not a terrible risk. Let's see. Next question is, how many nukes hives do you recommend for a first-year beekeeper? I personally recommend 2. I like to start with 2 hives or nukes, just because that gives me some options that if one hive is not thriving, I know that it's maybe not just me, because the other hive is thriving. Also, if one or the other is struggling, or both are struggling, it gives me some options at the end of the year to combine my hives and give them a better chance for survival through the winter. Additionally, it's something where if I'm playing the odds, like right now, beekeepers lose an average of about 40% of all colonies that are managed every single year in the United States. So if we're playing the odds, if you have 2 hives, if one of your hives dies, now in the springtime, you can do some swarm prevention methods and divide your hive into the empty hive rather than having to start over with new bees every year. So 2 hives is usually not that much more expensive or that much more time. You can usually put them right next to each other to manage them. So that's why I usually recommend 2. You can start with a little something. If you can really only get one, but I like to get 2. Let's see. Oh, so when do we start? So if you're starting off feeding a brand new hive, then when do you stop feeding them sugar water? So with packages, I guess I'm pretty ruthless with packages. Some people like to feed them a lot longer, but I give them the can that's in the package, and that is usually it. Because usually we receive packages in April, just like we're going to be receiving them tomorrow on April 3rd. So there's already a nectar flow on. So I usually feed them the remainder of that can, and then I will do an inspection a week or so later and see what they're up to. Usually they are already storing nectar. So if they are already storing nectar, I stop feeding them because there is nectar outside to be had. If you are starting from scratch and you have just foundation frames, a lot more people will be like, feed them longer, because that artificial nectar flow that you're feeding them causes them to want to build a lot of comb. So they'll be sucking up the nectar, excreting wax, and then building out that comb faster. I find that the nectar flow in my area is so heavy that they'll do it anyway. So I prefer them not to be storing sugar water just in case. So I stop feeding them straight away. But there are different camps that feed them throughout the year, especially in the fall, because in the fall, if you have foundation frames and you stick them in there and there is not a nectar flow present, those bees are not going to touch those foundation frames. So in the fall, if you still have foundation frames and you want them to be drawing comb, you can feed them a little bit of nectar, but I usually let them be and do what they're going to do. Let's see. Do bees prefer water sources in the sunshine? I'm actually not sure about that. I have read that they like brackish water more than just plain crystal clear water. It might be because it has more of a scent and it's easier to broadcast, but I don't know sunshine versus not. Usually I see bees in the sunshine. So if I see a bunch of shaded plants, often I don't see bees on them, but that is very anecdotal. So I am not sure. It'd be a good experiment to see if the bees like sun or not. And let's see. Should you get your nukes from the same breeder, or is it a good idea to get from 2 different sources? It depends. Like, I don't mind getting nukes from the same producer. So especially if I'm just getting 2. At this stage, I have about 30 hives in the Bay Area. So sometimes I do breed most of my own bees, but sometimes I introduce bees from other sources just to see how they stack up next to my bees. So that's pretty nice. So if you want to try to see a difference between 2 beekeepers, so I don't really have a preference. But sometimes it's neat to get those fancy queens. So especially if it's a hobby, if you want one of those like fancy hygienic queens or one of the ankle biter queens, if you want to see how those 2 genetic lines stack up, it's cool. So why not? And let's see. Do you recommend all the same size boxes? I do, but that is just because I am going for convenience of me. And less so for the convenience of bees. I, as an engineer by training, prefer completely modular setups. So having deep boxes at the bottom and then medium boxes on the top, I feel like I just always have the wrong size frame. If I'm doing the expansion method where I'm bringing frames up, I can't bring the deeps up into a medium. It's too hard. So I run all mediums. So all of my boxes are medium boxes. That being said, using deeps and mediums is totally fine. I would not use all deeps. That is a recipe for back problems because a deep full of honey can weigh about 100 pounds. So you don't want to deal with that. I go for mediums because I'm a tinier person. It's harder for me to lift that. And honestly, if I was starting over, I would work with 8 8-frame equipment, which has become a lot more popular since I started beekeeping. 8-frame equipment is just a little bit narrower, got 2 frames less in it, and is just a little bit more lightweight for a petite beekeeper or a beekeeper not wanting to lift 50 pounds of honey in a box or make multiple trips. So I like them all the same size. If you're going in like the Serge Lebesque camp, he actually does double deep frames. So extra large frames, in the thought that queen bees prefer to lay large sheets rather than these short medium frames. So there is some evidence to show that bees do like the bigger frames, which is why there's deeps on the bottom, mediums on top, and then these double deeps from Serge Lebesque. But again, like I said, I'm going for my convenience at a slight disadvantage for the bees, perhaps. Let's see. My due diligence as a beekeeper when I superseed cells have disappeared in between inspections. Let's see. I'm not 100% sure I understand that, so you might have to email me offline or give me some clarification. So Raymond, give me a little bit more information on that, or we can send an email. And let's see, in the summer, I find a lot of drowning bees in my swimming pool, 5 or 6 a day. Any way to reduce this? So yes, so this means the bees are probably trying to drink water in the hottest periods of the month. So I would try to create a more appealing water source. So if your hives are right next to your pool, maybe move them a little bit further away. And if you have a fountain with water running over rocks, that might be more appealing for the bees. So you might even be able to train them a little bit with some sugar in the water. Maybe not for too long because you might have an ant feeder or something like that soon. But that can usually attract them to that source, at least temporarily, so that they can start relearning that new source. So try to make a more appealing source and move your bees further away from your pool, if at all possible. So it's definitely about creating a more appealing source, especially if you have a pool cover to reduce evaporation. Try covering your pool more often and having that water source, the alternate water source, available more of the time. So it looks like I think I've hit the end of questions, but we'll be sending out a replay of this. So if there's anything I said that you wanted to see, or if you missed something, we'll do a replay. And you can feel free to send questions on the Google group or to me later. And thank you guys so much.